Alright, greetings ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Today we are going... That was the worst intro known to man. That was horrible. Okay, anyway. Rewind. If you're wondering why I'm wearing a hat, I have a bad hair day, okay? Don't judge me. I'm not wearing this inside to try and be cool. Bad things are happening under here, and that's all you need to know. Alrighty, hello again everyone. Today we are talking about Malaysian Airlines Flight 370, a aircraft that is very well known not only in the aviation community but in the public as well. For those of you who don't know, I will explain briefly what the deal is with Malaysian Airlines Flight 370. Malaysian Airlines Flight 370 went missing on March 8th, 2014 on a flight from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. It was only an hour into its flight when all radar contact and radio contact was lost. The aircraft hasn't disappeared like that since Air France Flight 447. The search area for MH370 is almost as big as the United States. So trying to find one aircraft in that large an area that is mostly all water is near impossible, and has been going strong for 2 years and they still haven't found anything to really support what may have happened to the aircraft. So today we'll be discussing what really happened to MH370, what theories are out there, why these theories are likely, and why they are unlikely. So without further ado, sit back, relax, and let's jump right into it. Now, one theory that jumped into people's heads very early on was a possible hijacking, which has not happened in a very long time, but is a very unlikely possibility with the amount of security that is enforced now, but is not completely impossible. It became very prominent in the investigation when 2 passengers were found to have boarded the plane with stolen passports. It also was more evidence against it when it was found that the first officer was known to let people in to the cockpit as sort of to impress them. Often it was ladies. He could have let someone in. Maybe it was a pretty girl, but maybe that pretty girl had some sort of weapon on her person. Now, however, there are holes in this particular theory. The main reason is pilots have a way to notify the ground if something's going on. They have a transponder code that they can put into the transponder that lets everyone know something's wrong. And it's a way to sort of let an emergency signal go out without the hijackers actually knowing that they're doing something. The second hole is that the users of these stolen passports had no connections with any kind of terrorist organizations, past, present. But it still does not completely eliminate it, and this is certainly one of the more likely possibilities, and certainly one that I hope, personally, is not the case. Explanation 2 is one of the scariest incidences that can happen to an airliner, and that is an onboard fire. The reason that this is a possible explanation is that the ACAR system, or Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System, was suddenly turned off, and also there was flammable cargo to known to have been on board, potentially flammable lithium-ion batteries that the aircraft was carrying. These kind of things can really mess with the electrical systems, and lots of systems failed on MH370 before it was lost, just sort of suddenly and all at the same time, which is a trademark of an onboard fire. Also, the aircraft made a very abrupt left turn just after it was lost, which could indicate the pilots were trying to turn around or trying to land somewhere because they were aware they had a fire on board. And like I said, this is a very scary situation because it can cause so many problems with the aircraft systems, but also it can cause problems to the oxygen and can render the crew and passengers completely helpless. The oxygen masks that come down from the ceiling only provide about 12 minutes of oxygen. Now, the reason that there's holes in this particular explanation is that there was no radio call of any kind. Granted, the fire could have knocked out the radios, but there was no kind of radio call of any kind or any kind of transmission to make contact with anyone to let them know that there was a fire on board, which is the first thing pilots are trained to do. If they have an engine fire, they shut down that engine, they pull the fire suppression, and they let people know, pan, 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 we have a fire on board. That's the first thing they do. And this did not happen in any way. And so it makes it a little unlikely, but like I said, it is possible that the fire knocked out the radios as soon as it started. Another reason is that the ACARS system continued to transmit for 7 hours after the last radio call. that means the airplane was still flying for 7 hours, which if there was a fire on board, a fire would have brought it down by then. Either that or the crew would have had it under control by then or something. And in either case, even if they didn't have it under control, an aircraft should not be able to fly that long with a fire on board, especially with flammable fuel on board as well. And just for a quick explanation, ACARS, essentially what it is it does not track the location of the aircraft, but what it does is transmit information from the airplane to a satellite to the ground. The kind of information that it transmits is basically diagnostic information of the aircraft. It does not transmit location, it does not translate altitude or speed, it transmits oil temperature, fuel load, engine temperature, how the aircraft is operating, if there's a problem on board, which is something investigators can use to see if there was an issue aboard the aircraft, a mechanical issue of some kind, which there wasn't apparently in this particular case. Now, another one that jumps into people's heads is a pressurization failure. This has been known to happen, has happened a couple times in the past fatally. What could have happened is the aircraft was not pressurized properly, and once it got above around 10,000 feet, you start to slowly lose pressure. And this has happened before, once with a Learjet and with a 737, are the two main prominent accidents. In the case of the 737, pressurization was lost slowly. The oxygen mask did come down, but as I mentioned before, they only provide about 12 minutes of oxygen. For some reason, the crew did not realize what was happening, weren't sure what was going wrong. They had some alarms, but they didn't know that it was depressurization. So, and the outcome was that two fighter jets were scrambled to look at and intercept it. What they found was a ghost airplane. What they call a ghost airplane was just flying along on autopilot, and they could look in the windows and see everyone in there was slumped over and gone. And it's kind of a kind of scary prospect, honestly. In the case of the 737, there was one crew member, a steward, who was somehow still conscious, somehow managed to receive oxygen. Made contact with the fighter jets by just hand signals and telling them that he was going to go down. And he tried to lower the plane, but obviously having no flight experience of his own, and the fact that the airplane had run out of fuel, he ended up crashing and wasn't able to save the aircraft. In this case of the Learjet, it was very similar, where they scrambled a fighter jet to go see it, and they could tell right away that there was ice coating all the inside of the windows, which is a very obvious explanation, is depressurization, or loss of oxygen. This could have very well happened to MH370, as it kept flying sort of just on autopilot for 7 hours with no communications. So that could mean everyone on board was deceased. The whole with this one, though, is the fact that it made a bunch of different turns, I believe 3 turns on its course, which was not programmed into the autopilot. So someone had to be there controlling the aircraft, whether that was the case like with the 737, where there was one crew member who was still conscious somehow and was trying to save the aircraft. That could be a possibility, but it also could mean the crew themselves were still fully conscious and aware and very much in control of the aircraft, which would eliminate the possibility of a pressurization failure. Now, this next one is a very sad one, and unfortunately is the one that has the most leads to it. That is pilot hijacking or pilot suicide. This is an incredibly rare occurrence. I believe it's only happened once or twice before since aviation has been a thing. The leads for these ones is that a lot of turns were made after the last radio call, as I mentioned, and eventually was pointing the aircraft towards Antarctica, which would be a place to go where there's no contact, where people can't find you or reach you or anything like that. And as I mentioned before, it kept flying for 7 hours afterwards, as if it was in control. And the transponder was turned off, as well as the ACARS was lost, as well, as mentioned earlier. Transponder is, for those of you who don't know, essentially transmits a special signal. They'll give you a squawk code. It's called squawking, so that tower will say squawk 2765. So you'll put 2765 into the transponder, and you'll be squawking at 2765 until they'll know all your information, essentially. This was switched off, so that information was lost, as well as the ACARS system was switched off. While the transponder is relatively easy to turn off, the ACARS is not very easy to turn off. So if someone were to have to turn it off, they'd have to really try to do it. It is possible to do, but the majority of pilots wouldn't know how. They're not trained to know how to turn it off because there's no reason to turn it off. Also, Captain Zahari Ahmed Shur's wife had left him, I believe, the day before, which lends itself that he could have been in a very tough place mentally. However, him and the first officer had never had any kind of psychiatric problems before, and they had been tested many times. So that's really the only reason to assume that this is not the case, is that there were no previous signs from either of the crew members. Again, I really hope this isn't the case, especially if the pilots did try to save the airplane. This is not really a way to, you know, honor them by assuming that it was a suicide. I'm going to assume that it was not, but I cannot ignore the fact that it is one of the most prominent possibilities in this situation. Explanation 5 is catastrophic mechanical failure, which is incredibly unlikely, especially in this particular situation with the amount of systems that failed. Especially with the Boeing 777, which MH370 was, it has backups for backups and backups for backups of its backups. It has so many redundant systems to ensure mechanical failure is almost impossible. It is possible that, you know, the backup could have failed, the backup of the backup, and the backup of they all could have failed, but the likelihood of that is so slim, almost impossible, that it seems unlikely that a catastrophic failure is what occurred based on the amount of systems that were failed. Also, no distress call was ever made. Again, same situation with the fire. And also, it has an incredibly good safety record. The Boeing 777 has one of the best. I believe there's only, well, including this one, there's only 2 recorded crashes of the 777, yet it is such a popular airplane. It's been flying for so long. It has a fantastic track record, and that makes it a little more unlikely, but again, not impossible. There's a tripod sitting there.
Oh. Do you want to go to the pita pit and get supper with me? I'm buying.
The what?
Pita pit. You haven't had a pita pit?
What is that? I've never even heard of the pit. Okay. Let's finish recording this first. All in all, my prayers are with the families and friends of those who are on MH370 even to this day, even though it's 2 years later. It's still a very scary thing, and I can only imagine what was going on in those moments when the aircraft was lost. And it's kind of a weird thing to think that, you know, when everyone on the ground was freaking out, MH370 continued to fly for 7 hours. It was flying around for 7 hours, and Lord knows what was going on board. Still kind of hold up to that one little shred of hope that maybe there are survivors. Who knows? You never know, right? I mean, it's so unlikely at this point, especially 2 years later. If they were stranded somewhere, they would have, you know, starved or something by now. Always some glimmer of hope, and I'm holding on to that. And hopefully we can figure out what happened so this never happens again. Have any other theories as to why you think MH370 was lost, or if you see any holes in the facts that I was giving, if I made any mistakes, please feel free. I don't mind constructive criticism at all. Thank you guys for watching once again. Keep calm and fly high, and I will see you next time.